네, 그럼 지금부터 2022
From now
한반도
on, we
국제
would
평화
like to
포럼의
begin
4-2 세션을
the
시작하도록 하겠습니다.
4-2 session
4-2
of the
세션은 신국제안보
2022
질서와 한반도의
Korea
성장이라는
Global Forum for
주제로
Peace.
관제와
The
패널을
title of this
진행됩니다.
session is The
이번
Choice of the
4-2
Korean
세션의
Peninsula in
자장
the New International Security Order. And the moderator of this session will be the Senior Research Fellow, Mr. Jeon Byung-gon of Korea Institute for National Unification. Hello everyone, my name is Jeon Byung-gon. It is my pleasure to meet all of you. This session was initiated by the Ministry of Unification, and the session host is Korea Institute for National Unification. And the title of this session is The Choice of the Korean Peninsula in the New International Security Order. As you are well aware of, the US-China rivalry is escalating, and due to the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, there is a war. So among the power countries, the dynamic is changing, and it requires a new international security order. And this also changes the order surrounding the Korean Peninsula, and it also has huge influence to the unification of the Korean Peninsula. At this critical juncture, the Korea Institute for National Unification is now hosting this session to analyze the situation and to come up with the countermeasures. In this regard, we invited two presenters and three panelists. I would like to introduce the panelists today briefly. To my left, we have Professor Jeon Jae-sung of Seoul National University. Professor Jeon Jae-sung graduated at the Northwestern University of the U.S. for the international politics, and he is an expert for the international politics as well. And the second presenter is Dr. Han-kwon Kim, Professor of Korea National Diplomatic Academy. Professor Kim graduated the American University of the U.S. For the international affairs, and he is a Chinese expert. So he has many experiences, and he also studied in that area. After two presentations, there will be panel discussions, so I will briefly introduce the panelists as well. Since this is a session hosted by the Korea Institute for National Unification, I invited two panelists from the institute. First, we have Dr. Hyun Seung-soo. Dr. Hyun Seung-soo graduated the Tokyo University in Japan, and he is an expert in Russia. And he studies the relations of Korea with the surrounding countries. And we have Dr. Min Tae-eun graduated Iowa University in the U.S. and as an expert of the U.S., he studies the unification policies of Korea and Korea-U.S. relations. Last but not least, we have a panelist from China. We have Professor Jung Ji-yong. Hello. I think you can hear me well. Professor Jung is from China, and he is an expert on the Korean Peninsula issue. So he will talk about the Chinese position, and he will also talk about policies. Then we would like to begin the session. The session will provide simultaneous interpretation service. Korean channel is number 3 and English is number 4. And for the online participants, you can ask a question during the Q&A session. So I look forward to your participation. Please use the Q&A link
세션에 참여하실 수
then you
있습니다.
can actively participate in this session.
그러면 이제 발표를 시작할 텐데요.
Then
저는
we would like to
사회자로서
begin the
이
presentation, and as
세션이
a
원만하게
moderator,
진행될 수 있도록
my role
하는 데
is
여러분들
making sure that the
중심으로
session goes
개입을
well,
좀
and
자제하고요.
I will limit myself in intervening the
발표자 두
session.
분께는
And
발표
for the
시간을 20분
presenters,
이내로
I would like to
드리도록
give you
20분
20 minutes each.
이내로 두 분의 발표를 먼저
So
들을
please
후에 세
finish your
분의
presentation within 20
토론자의 그
minutes.
토론을 듣도록
Then
하겠습니다.
we'll
세 분
have a panel
토론자께는
discussion with the
약 한
3
7분
panelists.
내외로 시간을
For each
드리도록
panelist, I will give
하겠습니다.
7
그런
minutes.
연후에
After that,
플로어나
we'll open up the
온라인으로
floor,
참여하시는 분들의
and we'll
질문을
also
다
accommodate the
받아서
questions from the online
그에 대한,
participants
질의응답을 받는 그런 시간을
so that we can have a Q&A session with them.
그러면은 순서대로 먼저 전재성
Then
교수님께
we will first turn to Professor Chun.
네, 감사합니다. 먼저 이렇게
Thank you very
좋은
much.
자리에
Thank you very
주제로
much
발표자로
for having me
해주신
as a speaker for today. I would like to thank the keynote for having me. Thank you.
굉장히 어렵고 폭넓은 주제라서
This is a difficult topic and this is a comprehensive topic.
이 파워포인트를 넘기는 건가요? 네. 나왔군요, 뒤에.
Okay.
그래서 어느 정도 이제 다룰 수 있을지
So I'm not sure how much I can cover.
어려움이 있습니다만 그래도
There is a
제가,
time limit and some difficulties,
주제가
but
이제 세계
we have
질서의
a topic,
변화이고
the changes in the
그것이
world
한반도에
order,
미치는
and
영향,
what is the
주로
implication
미국과
and the
중국의
impact on the Korean Peninsula,
외교 대전략,
especially
그리고
focusing
인터전략이
on
어떻게
the
서로
diplomacy between China and the
부딪히는지
US,
그런
and
내용을
how
좀
there is a
말씀드리도록
confrontation
하겠습니다.
between those two
먼저
powers.
우리 토론자 선생님들께 보내드린 파워포인트가 있었는데요.
And I share the PowerPoint along with the panelists, but I have slightly modified this one. But there is only slight modification, so the general flow will be the same.
먼저 이제 미국의 외교 대전략 부분인데
So the grand strategy of the
미국의
US.
대전략의 전체적인 기본 틀은 여전히
So the basic framework of the grand strategy of the
우세 전략이
US is to maintain its primacy.
바이든 트럼프 간의 이제 연속성과 단절성
And there will be some continuation and discontinuation between the Biden and Trump. But you can see there are some trends within the US. US has their concerns and US is working on various discourses. However, the discourse itself is quite ambiguous. They want to maintain the supremacy, primacy. That is a trend, however. And for the rivalry against China, they're trying to check the activities of the China. However, they were checking on China. So in that case, they are not sure about the grand strategy about the Liberal Party or the US. They were concentrated too much on China and they were losing the global trend. They were checking on China to be successful on China, and they need to re-establish the liberal order on the liberal groups. Checking China is a secondary option for the last 30 years. The US has been working on the primacy, and probably they need to focus more on the overall primacy and how they can work along with the other liberal groups. America First policy is one of the top priority for the US. When you take a look at some of the acts like a reduction of the inflation and the acts related to IP and semiconductor, you can clearly see there is a trend within the commercial strategy of the US, and they focus more on their own national interest, and sometimes they were facing some conflict of interest with their allies. And there has been some controversy about the EV produced by South Korea. So anyway, the US needs to hit the balance among many of the priorities they have. And as one of the key allies of the US, Korea is paying keen attention to this one. The reason I'm telling you about this is because the US and China is currently working on some of the competition or the rivalry. However, the US is still building its ultimate purpose. We should pay attention to it. In the case of the China, Dr. Kim will cover more about China. China is now my expertise area. So again, the core
부분이 굉장히 강한
goal and the
부분이
intention
있어서
of the
지금의
diplomacy
중국의
toward
위상을 생각해 볼 때
China
정확한 외교 대전략의
has
내용이
not been clearly
굉장히
defined
중요합니다.
by the US.
두 번째는
So we need
국내용의
to
외교
pay keen attention
대전략과
to
이제
the
대외적인 외교
content.
대전략이 섞여 있기 때문에
And there is a
미국이
mixture between the
인식하기로는
internal
중국의
and
국내적
external
권위주의가
policies.
대외적인 강압적인 비헤이비어가 더 강화된다 그런 일종의 대상 정책의
So,
측면으로 보고 있기
China is currently working on various
시진핑
aspects.
주석이나 공산당이 정권을 강화하려다 보니
So, President Xi Jinping and the Communist Party will be working on some of the cores, and probably it's not right approach from the international aspects. However, for the domestic, maybe it's going to be working.
할 필요가 있다는 거고요. 또 이론적으로는 중국이 추구하는 외교 정책의 목표
Currently,
중에
the China is
여전히
working on the
분단이
diplomatic
내부적으로 주권을 완성해야
policies,
되는 영토나
and they have
국내
some
또는,
territory
경제
issues.
발전,
They have some
경제
economic
발전
development
부분에서
issues
그것이 일종의 주권 관련
that can be related to their sovereignty.
이슈들인데 그게 대외적으로 국제 정치에서는 굉장히 현상 변경적으로
And currently, they are trying to change the status quo. For example, issues like Hong Kong or Taiwan.
부분도 있는 거죠. 우리도 같은 분담.
China, as a divided country, yes, can pay attention to those kind of sovereignty issues. And they are trying to change the status quo, but there are some issues like the southern China Sea. So, China's diplomatic policy can be defined as a change of the status quo. However, currently, we need to pay attention how it's going to evolve. The US has the 3C strategy. I am not sure whether the 3C can be practical and can be sustained, especially in the collaboration, in the MPT and hygiene. Probably the collaboration can be weakened as time goes by. The US is underlining mutual respect is really important. However, there have been many conflicts between the US and China. So there can be some of the conflicts and there can be some implication on the India-Pacific region, and there is a rapid evolvement of the encampment. The US and China underline the rule-based order. China talks about the rule-based order and the value-based order, but maybe the definition of the rule or the definition of the value can be different between the US and China. In the India-Pacific region, there are various competitions between the two countries. There are some international political changes, and the dynamics within the India-Pacific can be linked to the European countries, as you can see from the crisis in Ukraine. So the order is really complex, and I am sure the Kino is working on this topic. The security structure is changing. The multilateral structure led by the UN has been undermined, especially because of the Russia. So there is a fundamental changes. So what matters is whether the rule-based order that US has been working on can be maintained or not is the key issue. The Ukraine crisis can have impact on the China and Taiwan relations, but let me skip over that. Anyway, the US is criticizing the Russia and China because they are violating the existing rules. So, those kind of events has gave some reason for US to have the legitimacy to criticize China and Russia. And it is also true that maybe some country can use the nuclear weapon, maybe because of the Ukraine crisis. When do you think the war in Ukraine will be over? But what matters is not timing. What matters is how it's going to be ended. So within the US, even though the war is over, as long as Putin is in power, the Russian imperialism and that kind of a trend can trigger another crisis. Or there can be an incident where NATO may be engaged. So there can be continuous economic sanction against Russia. And if the sanction against Russia can be continued, there will be dire consequences. So in that case, there will be the strategic alliance between China and Russia. In that case, there will be confrontation between the NATO versus Russia, and there can be military clash between China and US, and in the worst case scenario can be there can be worst case scenarios. So once again, there are lots of changes within the security order. So there are variable factors that we need to consider. And it's going to have a huge impact on the Korean Peninsula. As I told you, the nuclear war in the past was only a logical scenario. However, now the nuclear war might take place. As I told you, there is a rivalry between the US and China, and there is a security order change within the Indo-Pacific. It's going to have an impact on the Korean Peninsula. So there are various rivalries between the US and China. In the past, it was only the economic realm. However, it is now going over to the military area and security area. And as you can see, mainly because of the Ukraine crisis, the crisis is now, the rivalry between the US and China is getting into the security realm. It's going to have a huge impact on the Korean Peninsula if there is a security rivalry and the military rivalry between the US and China. If there is a flashpoint within Taiwan, in that case, it's going to have some impact on the Korean Peninsula. So I would say the diplomatic situation is getting worse and worse. China wants to increase its military power, and the Chinese nuclear capability has been minimized. That's true. However, there can be a more possibility of the conflict with the conventional war or within the gray zone. So probably China will be working on enhancing its nuclear power. And maybe there can be a possibility for the nuclear arms control between the US and China. In Northeast Asia, if the nuclear has become one of the top agenda, maybe the denuclearization of the North Korea can be discussed. So that kind of the nuclear competition is not necessarily bad. The rivalry between the US and China is the rules-based competition, just like the internal domestic policies. If that is a policy competition, and if they are shying away from the violence, in that case, the competition is not always bad. Let me tell you a little bit more about the nuclear issue. Some people are skeptical. Some people are skeptical about the denuclearization in North Korea. The nuclear capability have become advanced, and North Korea wants to develop some of the strategic weapon. So people are worried, is it really possible to have the full and complete denuclearization in North Korea? There is a confrontation between China and US. So North Korea will get the opportunity of the new Cold War. Many people recognize the current situation as a next generation Cold War or the new Cold War. Probably there can be Chinese support to North Korea. And even under the economic sanction, the North Korean economy was surviving mainly because of the support of the China. So under the rivalry between the US and China,
미국과 협력 이슈로 여기지 않게
Probably China will not be collaborating with US about the NPT and denuclearization.
소리를 하거나 협력을 강하게 요구하거나 그럴 동기가 점차 줄어드는 거.
They have less motivation to ask for more activities on denuclearization. North Korea will have advanced nuclear capabilities, and North Korea will lose their motivation for denuclearization. And if this kind of trend is continued, there will be encampment between China and US. North Korea will lose its steam for denuclearization, and there can be more geopolitical risks. In that case, there will be two blocks and the two camps. And if North Korea has more advanced nuclear capabilities, then the denuclearization can be on the agenda whenever there is a serious issues between US and China.
그런 속에서 이제 아까 말씀드렸던 대만 문제가 더 중요해지는.
That's why I'm telling you again about the issue with Taiwan.
여부에 따른 통일의 어떤 방안 이런 거를
The US and China have been talking about the independence issue, independence declaration of Taiwan.
통일적으로 하기보다는 중국하고 좀
Taiwan
독립적인 그런
probably wants to be
가지게 되는 이거는 뭐
independent
남북한의
from
자연스러운
China.
것 같아요. 그래서 그 연구를 찾아봤는데
And I've been looking into some of the researches,
하는 비율이 굉장히 빠른 속도로
and there are more people who identify themselves as a Taiwanese rather than Chinese.
답한 비율은 30년 전에
And
20%였는데
compared to 30 years ago, and there are more and more people who regard themselves as Chinese.
세대들도 통일에 대해서 굉장히 무관심하거나
So just like Korean youngsters are not interested about the national unification,
양안 관계도 구조적으로 점차 멀어지고 있기
so there is a
중국이 통일을
more and more distance between China and Taiwan. Still, China wants to have the unification, and there can be some of the risks.
단계적인 통일이 되면 좋겠습니다.
The peaceful and the step-by-step unification can be desirable. However,
그렇게 될 가능성이 점차 줄어들고 있고
the possibility is getting lower and lower.
향후 연임
And President Xi Jinping,
기간이 이제 얼마나 될지는 알 수 없지만
I don't know how much longer time he will have in the future.
언급이 되고 있기 때문에
And one of his key
그런 미중 간의
agenda is the unification
군사력의 변화 가능성이
with Taiwan.
굉장히 많은
And there can be a possibility for the military confrontation or the military conflicts that's going to have some implication on the Korean Peninsula.
중요하게 생각하고 있기 때문에
US believes that Taiwan is important strategically.
를 생각해 보면 한 10년
So considering the future of the Korean Peninsula within the next 10 years, when there are some changes within China and within Taiwan,
북한이 비핵화가 되지 않은 상태에서 북중 간의 전략 연대가
if there is a stronger ties with China and North Korea without denuclearization, and when there is a more military tension, in that case, the situation on the Korean Peninsula will become worse.
경제 진영화에 논리
So again, I told you about the economic encampment.
이런 말씀을 드리는 것은 우리 지금 정부가 담대한 구상 얘기도 하는데
The Korean government is not talking about the audacious initiative, but regardless of the audacious initiative, anyway, audacious option is something that we must do. Otherwise, we're going to lose the last option for denuclearization.
비핵화를 통한 남북
So,
화해 협력으로
reconciliation between the two Koreas based on the denuclearization is really important, and that should be the facilitator between the cooperation with the US and China. We are losing our time, and if we lose this option, that we need to move on to the plan B.
해야 될 몇 가지 정책 방향인데 첫 번째는
Now, I would like to tell you about some of the political policy options that Korea should have.
정치적인 협상
The first one is strong military deterrence.
한미의 확장 억제력이 뭐 어떤 형태로든지 간에
The extended deterrence should be enhanced
효용성이 약화돼야
to reduce the efficacy of North Korean nuclear weapon. Only then, North Korea can be more motivated to come back to the negotiation table.
비전에 대한 아주 강력한
And we need to have a longer roadmap even after the denuclearization in North Korea.
신뢰 구축을 이번 정부도 강조하고 있는데
This administration is underlining trust building, and trust building is really important.
예측 가능성이 늘어나야 되고
And to help build the trust building, there must be institutionalization of the trust, and the trust should give some tangible outcome.
상대방이 감당해야 될 청중 비용이 굉장히 높을 때 그럴 때 상대방이
So, in that case, trust can be built, and we should be able to predict the behavior of the counterpart.
노력이 필요하다.
Again, to build trust, we need lots of preparation. As a conservative administration,
통일부에서 강조하기도 하고요. 신뢰 구축
can have some continuous policy from the previous administration, trust,
외교적인 노력,
extended deterrence, and diplomatic efforts,
북한의 발전에 대한 구체적인 계획.
and the long-term plan even after the denuclearization.
우리가
They are really important to make it happen.
우리의 외교 전략과의 조화도 필요한데
We need to align our diplomatic policy and our Indo-Pacific
구조가 필요한데
Indo-Pacific
생각해볼
policies
30년 동안 이제 북핵 문제가
for the last 30 years.
회담이나 93년에 시작됐다고 한다면 30년
We have been doing some of the nuclear negotiations.
근본적으로
However, international politics will change in the future.
체제 생존이나 뭐 여러 가지 안전 보장을
North Korea
위해서 필요로 하지 않게 된다면
may not need US anymore for the survival and to continue its regime.
떨어지기 때문에
In that case, the steam for the US and North Korea negotiation will be going down. So, it is high time for us to think about a new discourse or the new concept. We need to have some new offers. We should come up with a new ideas and a new policy towards North Korea. We need something big right now.
거긴 적은데요. 민족 협력에 의한 국제정치 강대국 경쟁을 극복한다든지
For example, there should be more cooperation between the two Koreas.
보다 나은
We need to go beyond the liberal order that has been led by the US.
협력을 통한 한반
We can have inter-Korean cooperation to make Korean Peninsula as a more advanced country, and we can have some better leadership in the international politics. Anyway, we need to go beyond what we have been doing for the last 30 years.
라고 할 수 있는 좀
We need to have a big declaration so that we can
정부를 거치면서
think the declaration we make can be a really good one even in the future.
외교력이 부족하다는 뭐 비판일 수도 있지만
Some people criticize that Korean diplomacy was lagging behind. However, it is also true the world dynamics was too fast.
통일 부분이 있고 시간이 다 됐는데요. 이게 마지막인 것 같습니다. 그러면서
Last but not least, let me put it this way. China is a really important cooperation partner.
이중의 전략 경쟁에 좀
As I told you,
어려운 부분이
there are many factors within the rivalry between the US and China.
협상이 이어지면
So there should be some progress in the inter-Korean relations, and there should be some progress in the negotiation. In that case, China can be motivated to come back to the negotiation.
빠지기보다는 북중 관계에서 여러 가지 이슈들이 있기 때문에
Between China and US, there are various issues, so we need to analyze those issues.
사실 여부를 떠나서 일본도 같이 포괄하는
And probably we need to have collaboration with Japan when we are making a policy towards North Korea.
감사합니다.
Thank you.
전재성 교수님께서는
Professor Chun, thank you. He talked about the grand strategy of the US,
하시고요. 그에 따라서 인도 태평양 지역
and he also talked about the
안보 구조
Indo-Pacific
짚어주시고
security structure changes.
한국의 외교 안보
He
환경에
also told us what is the implication to the diplomacy and security condition on the Korean Peninsula.
함의도 제시해
He also suggested some of the policy implications, military deterrence, denuclearization discussion, even though that's not going to be an easy one. But we need to have the diplomatic policy to be aligned with the North Korean policies. Now I would like to pass up the microphone to Professor Kim.
예, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. First of all, this is very important topic, and with the experts from many parts of the world, we can now talk about this issue and share my opinion. So thank you very much. I would like to extend my appreciation to the Ministry of Unification and Korean Institute for National Unification. And personally, I believe this is a learning opportunity for me as well. And I set my timer, so even if the alarm goes off, you don't have to worry about it, and I will finish my presentation within the time. Previously, Professor Chun summarized well, and he is an expert, so I agree with his opinion. So, on top of his presentation, I would like to build on and make my presentation. So, thank you very much, Professor Chun, for your presentation. Personally, I believe that in the new international order and in the Korean situation, there are three important parts. First, there is escalated rivalry between the US and China, and the China is continuously increasing its influence, and there are many analyses including together this, but I believe the preventive competition of the US is one of the factors, and there is a rise of the new security order. There is a formation of the camp, and there is a concept of economic security and trust value chain, and there are linkage between the US, NATO, and Indo-Pacific area. So how we can respond to this? And under this situation, when there are influences toward the Korean Peninsula, I believe there are possibilities that there will be the formation of the camp of the Korea, US, and Japan versus the DPRK, China, and Russia. From the Jiang Zemin period, in the 21st century, they said that this is a strategic opportunity. And in the period of Hu Jintao, how we can neutralize the Chinese rise was discussed, and there were many topics such as the peaceful development and harmonious world. So we made a preparation so that the rise of China is not threatening to the US or Western countries. However, in the Xi Jinping area, in 2013, there was a meeting, and President Xi said that this is the best time since the beginning of the modern time. And in the second term of his tenure, he changed the position. So this change was seen as a positive one. However, in the later time, it was seen as a negative one. And the main cause of this was the rivalry between the US and China. China wanted to have a peaceful development. However, now it is inevitable to have this rivalry with the US. So competition is inevitable. Personally, when we look at the Korean situation, there is a situation of the US and situation of Korea. And in Korea, we can think about the power transition theory and offensive realism. So this rivalry between the US and China can be seen as a hegemonic competition, and many people think that it will evolve. Personally, I believe that from the 1980s, there was a preventive competition and preventive war theory. So I believe we can look into this theory. With the rise of China, there are preventive motivation, and the influence is growing continuously. So it evolved into the preventive competition. International norm and order is now competing, and without the physical confrontation, still the US is going ahead. So it is trying to keep the China in check. And the US also had a war with the allies. And when it comes to the preventive competition, One of the examples is the collapse of the Cold War, and in the 1990s, with the sanction on exchange rate, the U.S. also kept Japan in check. So those are the examples. Currently, there are competitions over norms and order. The U.S. is now trying to enhance its own interest and trying to widen its gap with the following countries so that it can avoid any competition in the future. Current focus is advanced technologies and technological hegemony. Who will take the hegemony will be the focus. In this situation, currently the U.S. is implementing the preventive competition, and the first phenomenon is the formation of the camp. The key word is the human rights and democracy. This is the universal value of the word, and the U.S. is now criticizing China as a violator of the democracy and human rights, and also mentioned about Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region and Hong Kong, Taiwan. So now the formation of the camp is turned from US versus China into the free world versus China. And of course, China responded to this, so it emphasized the diversity of values. The U.S. ideology is universalism, and each country and each region has different culture and different systems. So the diversity of values should be recognized, and that was the argument of China. As a matter of fact, in China, Asia, and South American region, there are authoritarian countries. So we can see that there are a coalition of China with other countries. So currently, many people see that this is a competition between the free world versus China. However, I don't think like that. Now we can see the coalition of China with the other countries, because the free market is not that clear. However, these authoritarian countries is likely to agree with the diversity of China and diversity of value. And second, the U.S. emphasized the economic security, and it tries to move ahead in the advanced industries in order to protect the economic benefits. Security was used as a tool. However, nowadays for the security, economy is now used as a tool. And in particular, the U.S. has its norm and order. It is creating new norms and order with the partners and allies. And it wants to have this new norms and order recognized universally. For example, there are TTC and IPEF, and these are the stepping stones for this period. However, this universalism should be recognized in the world, not just in the free world, but also in other countries. For example, Saudi Arabia and Vietnam. Currently, the U.S. is expanding its trusted value chain.
이렇게 신뢰 가치 사슬이 미국이 확대해 나가니까
The US is expanding its trust value chain, so China is now implementing dual circulation by focusing its domestic economy, and it also tries to maintain its supply chain. And there is AIIB and One Belt One Road Initiative and Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as well as the RCEP. So in the region, it tries to form economic bloc. And China in particular wants to create the BRICS Plus. For example, there is a quote, and when China currently quota is expanding, so China is trying to respond to the expansion of the bloc by creating the BRICS Plus. And in the semiconductor industry and the battery industry, it tries to establish the supply chain for the essential materials. And there was a Beijing declaration. And when we look at the content of the declaration, it tries to expand the BRICS Plus. And in the decision making, the role of the developing countries should be expanded. And at the bottom, you can see the high-level dialogue. And there are many countries participating in this meeting. They can be the potential members of the BRICS Plus. So this check and response is very fierce. And last but not least, I would like to cover the security area. Currently, the US, NATO, and Indo-Pacific area, there are alliances. UK, France, and Germany, and the Netherlands, they had the joint military drill and military exercises. And there is AUKUS alliance, and at the NATO meeting this year, AP4, Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand were invited, and China sees this as a threat. And in 2022, NATO specified that China is a challenge. So China recognized this as a threat, and as a breakthrough, it tries to maintain the cooperative relations with Russia and with Cambodia, North Korea, and many other countries. It tries to reinforce its relations. And Korea is one of the countries, conventional partner countries. And in order to make a breakthrough, it also solidifies the economic and security cooperation with the South Pacific area. And Minister Wang Yi visited 8 countries in southern part of the Pacific area to strengthen the economic cooperation as well as the security cooperation. And Australia and New Zealand are working together with the US. But in the nearby area, there are some countries working together with China. Then it would be difficult for Australia and New Zealand to focus on Indo-Pacific area. In Afghanistan and Ukraine, we were able to see some crisis, and this accelerated and facilitated this formation of the camp. After the withdrawal of the U.S. forces from Afghanistan, U.S. is now enhancing its relations with the Middle East, and there might be the possibility that anti-U.S. relations will be strengthened. For example, Korea and Vietnam are Confucian countries. However, these countries are not the anti-US countries. But I believe that there might be some coalition between China and many other Islamic countries. And there are also major EU countries that are sacrificing economy for security. And neutral countries, including Switzerland, are getting closer with China. Last but not least, I would like to look into the Korean Peninsula. At this critical juncture, some are worried about the formation of the camp. And now, Korea can be used as a breakthrough. So I believe we need to keep a close eye on this. As soon as possible, Korea needs to identify its identity and set the direction for the foreign policies. And second, in order to respond to the political situation of the Korean Peninsula, I believe we need to be against the formation of the camp. And we have a panelist from China. So personally, I would like to have a discussion with him. Currently, there is a formation of the camp in Korea, US, and Japan versus DPRK, China, and Russia. And for the stability of Korea and stability of the US, Korea wants to build the peace and have a ground for a long-term peace. So we need to identify and determine how we can work together with the US and how we can work together with China. Personally, I believe that we can work with the US so that we can implement the sanction against DPRK and have a dialogue as well. And with China, we can prevent escalation of the tension, and we can also prevent any provocation from China, as well as the humanitarian approach. So these will be the basis for the US and China relations with Korea. Thank you very much.
시간 내에 좋은 발표를 해주셨습니다.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentation within the time.
다 마쳤는데
Now we had two presentations.
많은 그 시간을 드리지 못한 점 죄송하게 생각합니다.
First, I'm sorry that I cannot allow you lots of time.
중국의 입장과 정책,
Professor Kim talked about the US-China rivalry, and
국제안보 질서
there will be the change in a new security order, and provided several keywords such as formation of the camp and economy for the security, and
또 한미일 또 북중로의 구도
also the formation of the camp between Korea, US, Japan versus DPRK, China, and Russia. So in this situation, what kind of position Korea should take? And at the same time, how Korea can work together with the US as well as China.
네, 그러면은 이제 그 토론으로 들어가도록 하겠습니다.
Now let's move on to the panel discussion.
지금 정지용 교수님
Professor Zheng Jiyong is the first
온라인
panelist.
괜찮은지 모르겠습니다.
Professor Zheng, can you hear me? He's joining online.
감사합니다.
네.
Thank you.
정지용 교수님 뭐 한국어나 영어 다
And
잘하시는데
either Korean or English,
편리한
whatever works for you.
해주셨으면 합니다. 네, 시간은 한 7분 정도 드리겠습니다.
About 7 minutes, Professor Zheng.
예, 감사합니다. 잘 들리세요?
Can you hear me?
네, 들립니다.
Very well.
네, 감사합니다. 그 중요한 자리에 초청돼서
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'd like to thank the Ministry of the Unification and Kinu. Thank you very much for having me.
박사님과 정 교수님의 그런 그 발표
Professor Chan and the Professor Kim,
이렇게 전적으로
I read your articles and about your ideas. I fully agree with what you say.
세 가지로 이렇게 되어 있습니다.
And there are 3 things that I want to tell you.
네 가지로 되어 있습니다.
Actually, 4 things.
독립 경쟁에 대해서
The first one is about the Sino-US rivalry.
그 세계 질서의 그 재편성은 아마 그게 장기적인 과정이며
And that's a long-term process.
100년의 그런 과정이 될 수
And probably it's going to be the process that is going to last for about 50 to 100 years. The US is working on the allies and the small partners. And probably they want to reshuffle the order of the world. However, China is different. China wants to maintain the world order. because
견해가 이렇게
the US has a different viewpoint and a dynamic viewpoint against China.
세계 질서에서
US believes that the China is getting more interest from the current world order, and China is taking a bandwagon approach. That is not a welcoming sign. And even though in the new order, if the US can get some benefit, probably the benefit can be less than China is getting. And if the China is getting more benefit, it can be threatening the position or the hegemony of the US. And if the China is rising like that, it's going to reshuffle the world order. And if that's the case, there will be serious implication on the Korean Peninsula. And you talked about the 3C strategy of the US. Well, that's the US strategy against China, but that's the unilateral idea of the US. They believe it's going to be a pressing measure against China. The US and China does not have lots of the collaboration between the two, and probably less and less collaboration will continue. Between US and China, there will be possibly more and more confrontation. It's going to cause more losses to many countries. Currently, there is a war between the Russia and Ukraine, and the European Union is more integrated, and the US is along with the European Union, and probably China will get some losses out of that. Many people would say there's a new Cold War, but maybe it can be worse than the new Cold War. And it's going to cause some kind of conflict or the flashing points, and that can be more serious than before. About the Chinese Strait and Southern China Sea and the Korean Peninsula, the tension is escalating, the risk of the war is going up. And after the party convention on the 16th of October, and there will be midterm election in the November in the US. So after that, we can probably tell how the things will unfold. And Russia's policy will be changed, especially during the winter season, because they are adjusting their policy and their invasion to Ukraine. At the end of this year, there can be some adjustment of the policy from many of the countries. Third, I would like to tell you about the implication on the Korean Peninsula. The US has the US value and is a democracy. And it's only trying to check the China, and that kind of control is not a good idea. There can be 4 factors. US is not interested in North Korea anymore. And it's going to only try to keep China in check. That can be a risky factor. On the Korean Peninsula and the East Asia, US is not willing to resolve issues. And North Korea can make the East Asian countries more integrated. And that can be another risk factor. Third, And US does not have any nuclear option and does not have any alternatives. So their sanctions might not be working. North Korea, after their border blockade, now have some capability to overcome the sanction and overcome the difficulties. And US is trying to keep China in check. However, by doing so, the North Korean issues cannot be resolved. The US and Korea does not have any alternative for North Korea. So, except for the support from the China, there is no other alternative. That's the implication to the Korean Peninsula. Now let me tell you about the future roadmap about the denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. There have been lots of the trials and lots of the offers. However, those actions were not working properly. The North Korean nuclear issue depends on two factors. The first one is the US strong resolve to address the issue and North Korea's willingness to get paid for their dismantlement of the nuclear weapon. And also whether the two parties have the strong willingness to make some exchanges between the nuclear dismantlement and the economic benefit. So, denouncing China cannot be a solution for the denuclearization. So logically, just denouncing China cannot be helpful. So rather than just denouncing China, having a collaboration with China, as Dr. Kim said, can be a better alternative so that we can work on the stability and tension reduction on the Korean Peninsula. However, unfortunately, these two conditions cannot be met. The North Korean issue can be a good excuse for US to have control on the Korean Peninsula. As long as North Korea's nuclear issue is not resolved, in that case, the US can have some excuse to engage on the Korean Peninsula. So once again, the US is not resolving this nuclear issue. It is not because they are incapable. They simply want to have the more security engagement. They want to have the better check against China. North Korea's denuclearization is the outcome of the provocation. The US has provoked North Korea, and North Korea declared itself as a nuclear-armed country. It's armed with the nuclear weapon already. So as you know, it's really difficult to encourage North Korea to give up nuclear weapon because they are already armed with a nuclear weapon. Of course, I understand that there is a slight hope for the denuclearization. However, what matters is the commitment and the willingness of the US, and whether US is willing to give the reciprocal measures to North Korea. If there is a wrongful mistakes between the US and North Korea over and over, the nuclear issue can be more complicated. Looking back the history, when the Korean administration is conservative, in that case they can convince the US. Then they had some tangible outcome. So having a conservative administration, I mean the Yoon administration, can be a positive factor because they can convince US to engage on the denuclearization process. The Yoon administration came up with the audacious initiative. And they have something new and those new offers should be fully utilized to encourage US and to encourage China, and the South Korean government should come up with some stabilizing measures.
실질적인 것은 이 담대한 기획 그런 문제는
The audacious initiative
북한보다는 먼저 담대하게 설득시켜야 할 대상은
should be targeted to the US rather than North Korea. The audacious encouragement should be made to the US. And we should come up with some of the measures which can be acceptable by North Korea. That's it from me. Thank you very much.
네, 감사합니다. 시간이 좀 초과됐습니다.
Thank you very much. You spend more time. However, this is a very special occasion, so we continue to listen to you. Professor Chang,
He talked about the Chinese viewpoint and the position of China. He talked about the international security issues, Korean Peninsula, and denuclearization issues, and some points about the audacious initiative. And we can have a more discussion if necessary.
계속해서 갖기로 하고요. 다음으로는 현승수 박사님.
we would like to move on to Dr. Hyun.
네, 통일연구원의 현승수입니다.
My name is Hyun Sung-soo from Korea Institute for National Unification, and I would like to talk about the relations between the PRK and Russia.
놀랬다고 할까요? 어느
First,
정도
I was
예상했습니다만
surprised.
지금
I expected that, but as Professor Zhang said, the DPRK nuclear issue and Chinese perspective and the responsibility of the US is the same position with Russia. So, in my opinion, even though it is already initiated between Russia and China, two permanent members of this UN Security Council, there will be more pressure from the UN level. But there will be also difficulties in putting the pressure to North Korea for the denuclearization. I would like to talk about the DPRK and Russia relations. In media, I received many questions, and as you know, Russia is now occupying the Donbas area of Ukraine, and there are two areas, two states, and they already created the diplomatic ties, and actually Russia didn't expect this and wants to further in Donbas area due to the war. Now restoration is required, and there are North Korean laborers who were dispatched from North Korea or Russia, and there were official talk at the diplomatic ministry. And if it is applied, then this is the direct violation of the UN Security Council resolution. But Russia said that this is not the case because Donbas is now part of the UN, and Syria and North Korea only recognize this country aside from Russia. So China and many other countries does not recognize these countries as independent countries. So Russia believes that this is an independent country. However, at the UN level, they are not the independent country. So Russia argues that it is not correct. That this is not a violation of the UN resolution. For about 8 to 9 years, I studied the DPRK-Russia relations, and as a matter of fact, there was no big event. Many experts studying the DPRK-Russia relations, they always said that since the inauguration of Putin, the perspective toward the DPRK and South Korea are the same. So there was no addition or subtraction. Russia is a big country, so the strategy or perspective toward the Korean Peninsula will not change based on small occasions. However, nowadays, I feel that there will be change in the future. As I mentioned before, Russia is strategically closer to Russia. It was initiated in 2014, and Russia wants to work with the DPRK. To do that, DPRK should develop economically. So, in the transaction, ruble was introduced, and through the South Korea, DPRK, Russia economic cooperation, now Russia is trying to use South Korea to develop the DPRK. Whenever there is relations, there was a media coverage talking about the closer relations between the DPRK and Russia. And between China and Russia, there was a summit in Vladivostok, and there were concerns that there are close relations between the DPRK and Russia. But now the situation is different. So I believe we need to change the perspective, and we don't have enough time, so I cannot go detail. But I believe the personal evaluation of President Putin toward Kim Jong-un is very positive. In 2018, President Trump wanted to use China to put pressure on the DPRK and achieve denuclearization, but it failed. So from 2018, there was a Singapore summit, and there was a series of changes. And at the time, President Putin made a comment. According to him, Kim Jong-un is very excellent strategist. So this time, Kim Jong-un won against Trump. That was the comment from President Putin. And in the DPRK Russia summit, he also said that the DPRK will not cave down. And I also made a comment in 2018 that now the DPRK has its nuke capability, and it can attack any other countries. And in March 2018, Putin had a State of Union address, and President Putin played a video. He didn't mention that which country it is. However, President Putin said that we have the capability to attack some area, but we can recognize that that area is Florida of the US. So we can understand that Russia is capable of attacking the Florida. And I remember that Putin shed a tear, and he determinedly said that many countries did not listen to Russia and they didn't turn to us. However, now this is the last chance, and I want other countries to listen to us. And he shed tears. That was the precursor of the Ukraine war. So what I want to say is that President Putin can be influenced by Kim Jong-un. Chairman Kim Jong-un. And in the past, Russia helped the DPRK, and Russia wanted to contribute to the denuclearization. However, from now on, Russia can directly provide the support to the DPRK. However, in the short term, Russia is in difficulties in economic terms. So in the short term, it will be difficult for Russia. So Russia is now expressing its friendly relations with the DPRK, and it is vetoing the sanction against the DPRK. It is not helpful. Rather, it is audacious cooperation. But at the UN level, Russia can support the DPRK, and it can also veto the sanction against the DPRK, and it can prevent further worsening of the economic difficulties of the DPRK.
러시아에 대한 연대감 표명은 상징적인 것이지만
So
러시아가
this
북한에 대해서 주는
relation between Russia and the
어마어마한
DPRK is
그렇기 때문에
merely
굉장히 어떤
symbolic.
경제적으로
However, the
북한의
help
경제
provided
활성화를
from
가능성이
Russia
높지
to the
않다고
DPRK
보지만
is enormous. So in the future,
북핵에 대한 거라든지 또는 북한의
for
어떤
the denuclearization
경제적인
or military cooperation between Russia and the DPRK, Russia can be more active in the future.
어떤 근거가 있다라기보다도
I'm not talking about this based on any evidence, but based on the information I gathered, within this year, Chairman Kim can visit Russia. And Russia also wants to distribute this kind of information. So what I want to say is that in the past, the relation between China and Russia was important, but now Russia can provide support to the DPRK in many ways. So this can have implication to the Korean Peninsula issue and denuclearization of the DPRK. So I believe the Korean government need to pay more attention to this. Thank you very much. You talked about Russian perspective, so it was very helpful to understand the overall situation.
Last but not least, Dr. Min, please. I'm Min Tae-eun from KINU. Thank you very much for the presentations. In my panel discussion, what I want to underline is this. The international order is led by US, China, and on the other hand, there is another group. Based on their national interest, the pragmatism or the practical interest is something that is forming the encampment. That's something that I want to underline. That means based on the practical national interest of the US, China, and the relevant stakeholders, the dynamics will change in the future. There is an encampment between the two sides. So actually, the borderline between the two camps is not clear. The EU response about the Russia's invasion in UK, Poland, and their position is pretty much clear. However, France, Germany, Italy, they have some engagement with the Russian trade about their crops and the energy issues. So actually, in the case of the Italy, they are suggesting some kind of ceasefire to Russia. In the case of the Taiwan, which is fully supported by the US, they are not clearly talking about their position. Even China may not abandon the European market and they choose the Russian market because of the oil price. Sometimes the US, even though they denounced Saudi Arabia before, however, they tried to mend the relations with Saudi Arabia. So what matters is the practical interest is the basic foundation for the activity of the countries. Many people talk about the encampment, but well, I don't think the rivalry between the US and China will become ever worse, because in the climate sector, the US tries to engage China in the climate change activities. China is a really important trade partner, and there are many US companies that are working in China, so they have to collaborate somehow. As a democratic country, US has lots of the domestic issues, and their resources cannot be solely used for China. The ethnic issues is related to the domestic issues, and in the US, there is a hatred against the Chinese Americans in the US, and their liberalism and the democracy is the foundation of the US, and US does not want to that kind of reputation in their domestic affairs. And US is fully aware of the consequences of their activities. So US should overcome this kind of dilemma. So the rivalry between the US and China will change, or even the direction will change based on the so-called domestic balance sheet, what can be working for their own interest. So we need to read the trend between the China and the US. Let me be more specific. There is a rivalry between the two, but it is not going to become worse and worse. Rather than focusing on a certain country, we need to come up with a diplomatic policy that is pragmatic and practical. To do that, the Indo-Pacific network and regional global cooperation is really necessary, and Korea should be engaged in those kind of networks. Having a multi-layered network can be really helpful because we have the multilateral mechanism rather than the bilateral mechanism only. So, when we have the multilateral and the multi-layered network, in that case, we can reduce the anti-sentiment within Korea, and also we can find out the opportunity to have the cooperation with China. Just like in the case of the Quad, so as you know, simply we cannot be a member of any kind of the network. We need to be cautious, of course. As many experts point out, the ROC-US alliance and the reputation should be fully aligned with the Indo-Pacific security, and we should have a Asia-Pacific region security alliance. I do agree with that. But regarding the Indo-Pacific security strategy of the US should be fully analyzed. The Biden administration is working on another type of the US first strategy. Regarding Taiwan and South China Sea, we are not sure how much military engagement will be made and whether US is superior to China. So Korea should analyze that fully. Based on that analysis, we should come up with a measure, and we need to update our policy to engage with the US. The orientation should not be set first. We need to continuously monitor and update our strategy and actions. The reciprocal ROC-US alliance is something that we talked about. To build the reciprocal ROC-US alliance, we should ask for what US can offer. But US is asking for the cooperation in the advanced technology area, in the semiconductor, and the reduction in the inflation. However, the response to that in Korea is in question. So that's going to be a really important test bed to make the ROC-US alliance as a truly reciprocal. So we need to try to keep our national interest. And we need to be cautious about whatever the US is offering, especially about the G4 membership. Regarding denuclearization, there are two things we should keep in mind. As I told you, the rigid diplomacy just based on the encampment is not helpful, because during the process of the denuclearization, the support and engagement of China is a must. Second, regarding denuclearization, the sanction relief cannot encourage North Korea to give up nuclear weapon, because for North Koreans, the nuclear weapon is directly related to their survival. And the US top priority would not be North Korea's denuclearization. So those recognition should be put into the policy, which means Korea should be driving the policy for the denuclearization, and the security guarantee and the safety of the regime should be guaranteed. In the process of the denuclearization, when we are making that kind of the policy, our position become heightened. And in that sense, the audacious initiative itself can be meaningful, but we need to have some follow-up measures to build trust about North Korea so that North Korean people can be convinced that the regime can be saved. Regarding the denuclearization, there have been so many options presented on the table, but we need to go step by step. The goal and the purpose of the short-term dialogue should be clearly defined. Rather than talking about complete denuclearization, we can talk about some of the options. For example, helping the energy issues within North Korea, or we can talk about the arms control about the nuclear issue. Relatively easy topics should be put on the table in the short-term view, and that can be helpful to encourage or convince North Korea to come back to the negotiation table. That's it from me. Thank you very much.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you.
이것으로 두 분의 발표
And we heard the two presentations, and we heard the three panel discussions.
조금 후에 코멘트에 대한
Just after a minute, I would like to give the answer time for the two presenters.
플로어에 계신 분들
I would like to ask if there is any question from the floor. If you have any question, please raise your question. And also for those who are joining online, if you have a question, please ask a question.
하겠습니다. 혹시 질문 있으십니까?
Is there any question? Yes.
안녕하세요. 코리아 타임즈
Hello, my name is Jung Jun-ho from Korea Times.
교수님께 질문이 있는데
I have a question to Professor John.
이제 진영화가 가속화되고
You talked about the facilitation of the encampment, and you also talked about the new Cold War, which is recognized by North Korea, if that is being continued.
이번 정부가 사실상 비핵화의 마지막 기회다.
As you said, this is the last time for the denuclearization or last opportunity for
현
denuclearization.
정부에서 제시하고 있는
But the current administration
북한 정책에 지금 북한에서 마땅히 지금 반응을
is
보이지
coming up
않고
with the policy toward North Korea, but North Korea is not responding.
큰 드라마틱한 상황 없이 계속 이렇게
And
상황이
if
흘러간다면
there is not a dramatic situation change, probably the denuclearization might not be possible. Is that your judgment?
그리고 현승수 연구원님이 지금 방금 교수님이 진단하신 그 판단에
And
동의하시는지도
Researcher Hyun, you also made a comment, so I would like to ask your opinion on this. And is there any other question? Please feel free to ask a question. We don't have enough time.
없으시면은 지금
If not,
참가자의 질문도 지금 아직 뭐 도착하지 않고
we haven't received any question from the online participant, and we have 7 minutes left.
두분 발표자분의 역순으로
We'll first turn to the presenters. First, Professor Kim.
보완하실 내용이 있으시면
If there is anything you want to add, please make a comment within 3 minutes.
두 분께
And
마이크를 넘기도록 하겠습니다.
And then I would like to give you the microphone to the people who received the question. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the question and presentation. And it was very helpful for me to organize my thought. I believe the Korean situation is the topic, and personally, between the US and China, we need to separate the area for cooperation, and we need to be realistic and practical. Denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is a universal value, and this is also related to the direction of the world. So whether US and China will pursue these values ahead of their own interest. Already, denuclearization between the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and the interest of the US already made this choice, and we cannot convince the US to turn the decision around. It is very difficult for us to change the minds of the US, and it is the same for China. China
저도 중국은
wants to have a buffer
미국과의
zone
전략적 경쟁에서
in the rivalry
전략적
against the
완충지대라는
US.
북한을 유지하는 거에 더 초점을 맞췄다고
And China is
합니다.
now focusing on
개인적으로 현 상황이
maintaining the buffer
부딪혔을 때
zone in the
미국은 북한에 대한
DPRK.
제재를 통해서 북한을
The US would like to have a sanction, and once the DPRK is on the negotiation table, then Korea can work together with the US. And from China's perspective, if there is any nuclear test or provocation,
한반도 주변 동북아 지역에서
then
한미
it
미일
means
동맹 그리고 미국이 원하는 한미
US
지역 안보 협력 체제와 미국 주도의 미사일 방어 시스템에
has
한국이
its
참여하는
missile
여론이
system
한국
and
쪽에서
its alliance
등등으로
with the
미국에
Japan and
유리한
Korea.
기회가 생길 수 있기
So
때문에
there might be an
중국은 이
opportunity
부분에
to the US.
즉 비핵화라기보다는
So regarding the
북한이 더
provocation
이상의
or
무력 도발로서
denuclearization
중국이 가지고
or
있는
nuclear
한반도에서의
test,
전략적 군사 안보적 이익을 훼손하는 부분을
China
방지하는
wants
것에
to
대해서는
prevent any
한국과 협력할 수
damage
있다는
toward their
생각을
economic
가지고
interest
있다고
or
생각합니다.
military
즉
interest.
한국이 이제는 이런
So
부분에
for
대해서
now,
명확하게
Korea
우리가 자꾸
needs to be
설득하려고
more
하기보다는
clear,
아까
and
말씀해주신 두 분
instead of
토론자분들도
trying to convince
말씀해주신
other countries,
강대국들의 이익
as other
중심의
panelists said,
국면에서 한국은
at the current situation, Korea needs to be practical.
협력할 수 있는 부분을 분명히 나누어서
So we need to separate the area for cooperation, and we need to focus on that cooperation. Thank you very much.
박사님 뭐 잠깐 말씀하시고 마지막으로
Dr. Hyun, please go ahead first. Then
죄송합니다만 저한테
I'm sorry.
주어진 질문이 아니기 때문에 제가 좀 약간 좀
I
다른
don't
생각을
think
좀 했었는데
that
간단하게
question
지금
was
어떤
directed to me,
질문이신지
so I was not here. Can you repeat the
북한
question
비핵화에
briefly? What was your question?
북한이 상황을 인식하고 있고 지금 이제 진영화가 가속화되면
Please use the microphone, otherwise we cannot provide the interpretation service.
진단에 동의를 하시는지.
아, 예. 그거는
Yes.
저는 동의를 하고요. 지금
I
사실은
agree
전재성
with
교수님께서
that.
분석해 주셨던
And Professor Chun made an analysis at the global level or East Asian level. He made an analysis, and I agree with him.
팩터를 끌어들이지
And
않더라도
even if we do not include the Russian factor, as a matter of fact, if there is any situation that can progress the denuclearization of the DPRK,
한반도에서는 상당히
then
라고 생각을 하고요.
it will be very difficult for the Korean
좀 심각한
Peninsula.
상황으로 가지 않도록 지금 관리하는
So
차원에서
I
조금 더
believe
저희가 좀 역점을
that we need to focus on the strategy to maintain the current situation.
네, 고맙습니다. 뭐 너무 좋은 그
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for wonderful discussion.
많아서 보안 차원의
Actually, I have so many things to add, but rather than adding my comments,
정 기자님, 네, 그 질문해 주신
I got the
내용은,
question from the Korea Times.
그 굉장히 시한이 촉박하다는 거는
And the time
생각하고요.
is ticking.
이번 정부도
Yes, the
아마
time is
그런 걸
ticking.
충분히
This
느끼고
administration,
있다는 그런 생각을
I believe, is feeling that the time is ticking.
김여정 담화가 이제 몇 가지
Kim Yo-jong made a clear announcement, and there is no trust between the two Koreas. So trust building measures should be made, especially in the economic area. The economic incentive might not be sufficient enough. So political and military or the security level, next step should be made.
또 하나는 문재인 정부의 운전자로
The Moon Jae-in administration said it is on the driving seat, but there was a criticism from North Korea. So, whether we have the diplomatic clout to lead the international society or the lead the US, otherwise, as I told you, probably the two Koreas can take the mind your own business approach. So we can have a kind of hostile coexistence. So what I'm telling you is that our policy toward North Korea has not been nullified. We need to be a little bit more desperate in convincing North Korea. The audacious initiative can lay the foundation for the negotiation about the denuclearization. I'm not sure whether this administration is willing to take the risk or is trying to give more economic incentive or something in return. I personally hope, as we are in the desperate situation,
그 협상 개시 조건에서의 어떤 담대한 스텝.
Probably we need to make some audacious step to resume the talk. So incentive is not good enough. Our diplomatic approach should make enough framework to resume the dialogue.
그냥 간략하게 한두 가지 포인트만
So there were
말씀드리면은
many good comments, but let me summarize in this way.
비핵화의 환경이 나빠지는 건 맞는 것 같아요.
It is true that the overall environment for denuclearization is getting worse and worse. China is not willing to cooperate. The US is losing the interest. The same in Russia. In the case of the Japan, their top priority is different. They are not that much interested in denuclearization. In Korea, the opposition party is against the current administration. The current administration is kind of isolated. It needs lots of efforts. So a comprehensive approach should be made. To do that, the partnership with the US is really important, as Dr. Min said. We need to clearly understand the international dynamics and the international trends. When we have a meeting with the Japanese counterparts, they say, we want to compensate something that the US is lacking, but Korea is not trying to make the compensation for the US. So they say the ROC-US alliance is different from the Japan-US alliance. Anyway, we need to enhance the ROC-US alliance in a different way. If the US is working on the rivalry against China and in the Pacific security strategies, well, there will be some adjustment of the policies because they are going to have the election. And the solidarity about the liberal group is not that strong. So probably we should come up with a better value and better solidarity than the US. So we need to enhance the ROC-US alliance that can be helpful for South Korea and that can be helpful to the US. And within that, enhance the ROC-US alliance, denuclearization is really important. Many other neighboring countries are not that much interested in denuclearization. And when there is a confrontation regarding the nuclear issue between the China and the US, the stability in the Northeast Asia can be damaged, and even the NPT can be damaged. The denuclearization issue is really important for the many other countries. However, we should convince other neighboring countries so that they can understand the North Korea's nuclear issue is directly related to them. For the last 30 years, we thought that status quo will make the world more developed. However, in the future, just keeping the status quo will make you lagging behind, or it can destroy you. So the world has changed. So keeping the status quo on the Korean Peninsula and across the world is not helpful at all. Sometimes if you're not doing something new, it can cause you some crisis. So we should do something dramatic. So if the rivalry between the US and China is going like this, probably in the future, it can go worse, or sometimes it can collaborate between the two. There are many other countries whose stakes is critical in the US-China rivalry. And as you know, when the two parties are fighting and when there is a non-collaboration between the two parties, there will be significant consequences. So as you know, the rivalry between the China and US, if it is going wrong, in that case, there will be significant consequences to other countries, including the Korean Peninsula.
시점에 있지 않나.
So we are at the critical juncture to make a better policy.
네. 이상으로 국제 안보 질서
With this, we would like to conclude the session entitled The Choice of the Korean Peninsula in the New Information Security Order. I always feel that
주어진 시간이 많지 않고
the time allowed
시간이
is not enough.
아쉽게 남습니다.
So it is regretful that we cannot cover all the questions. There will be another opportunity for a follow-up discussion.
이렇게 발표와
And for today,
토론으로 참여해 주신 분들
we had presentation and panel discussion. So those participants, presenters, and panelists, thank you very much for your participation. And with this, we'd like to wrap up the session. Thank you very much.